Good evening. Thanks for being here tonight. I'm Jennifer Johnson, co-curator of our exhibition Amending America. We are pleased to welcome you to the National Archives for tonight's program on the Equal Rights Amendment, whether you are here in the William G. McGowan Theater or joining us through YouTube. And also a special welcome to our C-SPAN viewers. We are pleased to present this program in partnership with the National Woman's Party at the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, and we thank them for their support. To learn more about all of our public programs and exhibits, consult with our monthly calendar of events in print or available online at archives.gov. There are copies in the lobby, along with a sign-up sheet so you can receive it by regular mail or email. Another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation, which supports work of the agency, especially our education and outreach programs. Pick up your application for membership in the lobby or become a member online at archivesfoundation.org. We are presenting this program in conjunction with our exhibition, Amending America. Only 27 times out of more than 11,000 proposals have Americans reached consensus to amend our Constitution. Our exhibit, Amending America, reveals the stories behind why some of those proposed amendments were successful and why others failed to get enough support. And of course, the Equal Rights Amendment is one of those failed attempts. In fact, it's been proposed over 1,100 times, or almost 10% of that 11,000. Written in 1921 by suffragist Alice Paul, the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced in every session of Congress from 1923 to 1972, when it was passed and sent to the states, but failed to achieve the necessary 3/4 ratification to be added to the Constitution. As part of the series of programs and events in conjunction with Amending America, on October 21st, 2016, the National Archives will present a national conversation on women's rights and gender equality at the National Archives at New York. Located in the Alexander Hamilton U.S. Custom House in New York City, a series of panels will discuss women's rights, gender equality, and advocacy and action. Registration is required and is available through the National Archives Foundation at archivesfoundation.org. Now on to tonight's program. It is my pleasure to introduce Paige Harrington, the Executive Director of the National Woman's Party at the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. Please join me in welcoming Paige to the stage.
Good evening. It's wonderful to be here tonight for this absolutely incredible topic. And I didn't quite realize that there were actually 11,000 that had not been passed. That was surprising. So I am Paige Harrington, and I am delighted to be here tonight. You may know us not as the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. I'm still getting used to that. Up until April 12th of this year, we were the Sewall-Belmont House on Capitol Hill. But when President Obama stopped by on the morning of April 12th, he designated the house as a national monument, and that changed everything. Exactly. So we became the 411th National Park Service site and only the 6th to tell women's stories. So we still have a lot of work to do, don't we? Going forward, the National Park Service and the National Woman's Party will have a very robust partnership. The National Park Service staff will be in place in the next couple of months, and they will begin to do a lot of the interpretation and the public tours. But you'll also still see the National Woman's Party staff. We continue to own and control the National Woman's Party archival collection, which is incredibly vast, and we will continue to work with researchers in the Florence Bayard Hillis Library. So we hope to welcome you all at any time to the house. So this year, 2016, is not only the centennial of the National Park Service, it's also the centennial of the National Woman's Party. I really like that symmetry. We didn't plan it that way, but that's the way that it worked out. Almost 100 years ago this month, women met in Chicago and began to talk about organizing the National Woman's Party. Founded as a party representing women's interests with a single-issue platform, the Woman's Party organized enfranchised women from the western states to show their strength at the voting booth and stand together to only vote for candidates who supported the federal suffrage amendment. Now, we all know that suffrage was won in 1920, but today we're here to talk about what happened after suffrage. By the summer of 1923, Alice Paul had written the original Equal Rights Amendment, and it had already been introduced the first time into Congress. NWP lobbied to see the Equal Rights Amendment introduced and continued to fight for the passage and ratification for more than 70 years. Our speakers tonight will share their thoughts on the long and often disputed campaign for the Equal Rights Amendment. Before I introduce our speakers, I definitely want to thank Susan Clifton and the rest of the staff at the National Archives. They've been a long-standing partner of ours with programs, and we're excited to be here tonight as part of their exhibit, Amending America. Now let me introduce our esteemed panelists. Dr. E. Fay Williams is the president and CEO of the National Congress of Black Women Incorporated. Dr. Robin Munsey is a professor of history at the University of Maryland. Dr. Kyle Ciani is the chair of history at Illinois State University. And Ms. Chris Myers is the director of programs at the Alice Paul Institute. Please help me welcome them to the stage. Thank you all for being here tonight. This is going to be a fantastic conversation. Over the last few weeks, as we've been planning this event, we've had a couple of phone conversations, and I know that each of the esteemed panelists brings something very impressive to this particular program. So I think we'll start off with just a couple of general remarks from each of you, and then I have some questions, and I'm hoping that the conversation will evolve from there, and we can just go back and forth. You are all experts in your field, and I know you to all be very gregarious, so I'm hoping that it's a robust conversation. So why don't we start with Chris Myers?
Sure. I'm delighted to be here tonight talking about the Equal Rights Amendment because it is Alice Paul's dream. Of course, she wanted women to have the right to vote, and she saw that happen in 1920. But one thing that she didn't get to see happen was her ERA, which she had started working for almost as soon as women got the right to vote. She called it, she said, there's nothing complicated about ordinary equality. She said what men do with their rights and what women do with their rights is up to them as long as they have them. And that's kind of why we're gathered here today in this vision. And we do carry on that vision where I work at the Alice Paul Institute at Alice Paul's home in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, not too far outside of Philadelphia. So we carry on her vision through our girls' leadership programs and our history programs, and the ultimate emphasis is on this concept of ordinary equality. So I think if Alice Paul were here today, she'd stop the panel where it is, and she'd say, okay, everyone go out and work for the ERA, but I'm glad that we're here talking about it and continuing the discussion of the Equal Rights Amendment and her ultimate vision of, again, that concept of ordinary equality. Thank you.
It's amazing. Dr. Kyle Ciani.
Well, I don't think everybody would agree with Alice Paul, right? And one of the things that I find very interesting about the Equal Rights Amendment is that it is so contested, that it has been so debated. It was debated since its inception. In 1923, it ultimately did not get ratified. 38 states were needed for the ratification. Only 35 made it. And then ultimately 5 of those also, I don't think you use the word reneged. What do you say?
Rescinded.
Rescinded? Is that it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they decided that it wasn't for their state. And the 14th Amendment, they believed, provided the necessary rights for all of the individuals. But as we go on in the program tonight, I have some quotes from one of the most adamant of the anti-feminists of the 1970s, who is still very active today, Phyllis Schlafly. she's so fun to talk about. But before, so maybe I'll just kind of throw some out, some of her little pearls of wisdom throughout the evening. But I want us to think about this other organization in, and I just want to read a quote to spark a little bit of thought that is perhaps a way to think about the Equal Rights Amendment a little bit differently than Alice Paul did. There's an organization called Against Equality, and in a 2015 series in the Women's Studies Quarterly, they argued that the ERA, quote, endorses equal treatment as same treatment, and was conceived at a time when families and the people inhabiting them were rendered in particular terms. Terms that have since drastically changed and shifted, not only the institutions like marriage or the workplace, but our very bodies. I'm still quoting from them. What does it mean to support women when the very category of woman is a contested one? And so, and I end the quote there. And so I want us to think about what it means for the ERA to have been crafted in a time when the heterosexual family was the only family that was considered appropriate. And when woman had a very distinct definition, and we're far more fluid, not everybody accepts that fluidity. And I think that's one of the reasons why times are so contested. So I'll throw out some Phyllis stuff later.
Thank you. Dr. Robin Muncy.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here and so glad for this opportunity to talk about the ERA. What I'm most interested in as an historian, and really, I guess in a way, as an activist now, is the opposition, the progressive opposition to the ERA, when my students are always just shocked to learn that when Alice Paul penned the ERA in the 1920s, the overwhelming majority of feminists, progressive feminists, opposed the ERA because it would undermine protective labor legislation for women. And that's what I'd like to talk about later.
Excellent. Dr. Ife Williams.
Yeah, well, when Alice Paul was thinking about the Equal Rights Amendment, we black women were thinking about just being equal in any way, just to recognize as human beings, perhaps. So one of the things that in our community we always say is that we support the Equal Rights Amendment. Of course, our organization is one of the lead organizations, and I'm one of the chief spokespersons for the Equal Rights Amendment. But we hope that our sisters will recognize that it is not the only issue in our community that we have to be concerned about, because we have criminal justice issues, we have poverty issues, we have voter suppression issues. We have so many. Our time is so divided. So when we're not at the table, we would hope that our sisters are there for us also, as we are on the issues like the Equal Rights Amendment.
Excellent, exactly. Well, Chris, let me start with you. Can you tell us a little bit more about the original Equal Rights Amendment and Alice's intention when she put that out? Do you think that what do you think she thought the reaction of it was going to be?
As soon as when we got the right to vote, Alice Paul is already thinking about the next steps. So she had started doing some legal research. She's working with some great legal minds of the time. And there was several drafts, I think at least 35 drafts of an amendment that she's going to make much simpler in its form, and that she's going to call the Lucretia Mott Amendment. And that's our first version of the Equal Rights Amendment that she introduces officially in 1923. She did not tell her party, though, that she had already made the decision to work on this. It was something kind of decided behind the scenes. And then in 1923, there's this great gathering at Seneca Falls, New York, and she says to her party members, hey, what's the next step for women? What should we do? But at that point, she's already decided what she's going to do. And she had already come up with some basic drafts of the Equal Rights Amendment. So I think that she thought that women would be very receptive to it. And I think that she thought that the United States would be receptive to it in some way. Particularly, I think originally she might have felt that women that worked in the labor forces would be receptive to it, because many of them were suffragists. So I think it probably surprised her initially that women in the labor forces and women in work and union women particularly immediately opposed the Equal Rights Amendment because it's going to eliminate those protective pieces of legislation. So I think her intent was good and she thought it was going to be received very well, but right away, right in 1921 actually, she realizes right away that she's got a key opponent in Florence Kelley, who is working for labor unions specifically for women, and wants protective legislation for women to help them in the workplace, to make sure that they're not being overworked or underpaid. And that's going to be one of the initial fights within the early part of the movement.
Okay. Now, you talked about the difference between protective legislation versus blanket legislation. Maybe you could just give us a little bit more of an explanation of both of those.
Sure, and please jump in because it's hard for me to explain. The protective legislation, the idea behind it was that women would have special restrictions within the workplace that would help them. So, for example, they would, a lot of protective legislation would fight for an 8-hour workday, which was seen as the key goal, or restrictions on how much you would have to lift, or the right to have bathroom breaks and things like that. Not to work at night. There was protective legislation to prevent women from working at night. And these are very helpful to women workers. However, Alice Paul is advocating for a blanket amendment. This is going to be at the federal level. And the women that wanted those special protections, they're afraid that if you pass a federal amendment, it will wipe out protective legislation. And that is what would happen. So there's that fight. Do women need these special protections in the workforce versus this blanket federal legislation that says that women are entitled to the same rights as men, or entitled to the same rights in the Constitution? So Alice's argument to that right away is, at first she tries to be accommodating. That lasts for about a year. And then she says no special protections, because if you give women special protection in the workplace, you give somebody, their employer, a way to discriminate against them. Because if the boss has to accommodate women in a way, you become a burden to the boss, and you get the first to get the boot. So there's more arguments that she had there, but that's the basic gist of the argument. Is there anything you guys want to add to that?
Well, I think today it would be hard to see how labor unions would be against the Equal Rights Amendment. I would think, and the ones that I meet, they're certainly for it. So things have changed in many ways, but the circumstances of women have changed too, because so many women are the breadwinner in their family. I know that's true in the Black community. We not only have to bring home the bacon, but we have to bring it home and fry it and keep the electricity and the gas on, so we have some place to fry it, and then wash the dishes afterwards and still have work to do. So I would think today that would not be an excuse that we're going to face with labor unions. I work for labor unions, and I believe that most of them today, while they've had negative images in the past, today they are really truly working so that we have equality. And I would dare say we wouldn't find a union that would be opposed to the ERA today.
The big change there came in the 1960s and 1970s. When Alice Paul first wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, the overwhelming majority of wage-earning women, women in labor unions, as well as their progressive allies in the middle class, opposed the ERA precisely because protective labor legislation like minimum wage laws, maximum hours laws, and other safety laws that were passed only for women would be undermined. And you probably know this, but in the early 20th century, the Supreme Court had made it, had declared it unconstitutional to pass that kind of protective labor legislation for men, but it did let through some of that legislation for women. And so the way that much of the labor movement and the progressive allies of the labor movement saw it in the early going was that the protective labor laws for women were an opening wedge, and that once women had those protections, they could eventually be extended to men, which of course in some ways is exactly what happened during the New Deal. So in the early going, the vast majority of people that we would consider feminists thought the ERA would hurt more women than it would help, and I think historians are pretty clear that it would have. So the 1930s changed that a bit with the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. That is a minimum wage and maximum hours law for men and women. So it looked like at that moment you think, well, okay, now we don't, ERA would be okay. But it turns out that, that we still operate under the maximum hours law of the Fair Labor Standards Act at the federal level, and that is not a maximum hours law that forbids mandatory overtime. That law, as you know, allows employers to require overtime. They just have to pay time and a half for it. For women who have children to take care of and who are primarily responsible for children, that law doesn't do them nearly as much good as it did men in the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s. Because if your child is going to be put on the curb by the daycare provider or the school at 6 o'clock, it doesn't matter how much your employer is paying you, if you can't stay till 8, right? You've got to get out in time to get your child at 6. So that kind of hours law didn't operate in the way that a lot of women workers needed it to, and so there were state laws that helped them out. One of the classics is the Michigan law in the 1940s. When you hear this, you'll cry your eyes out. It was a 54-hour law. What the Michigan law said was that after 54 hours a week, that's 9 hours a day, 6 days a week, employers could not require overtime of women workers after that 54 hours. And that was the kind of protective legislation that remained in place in the 50s and 60s that a lot of women workers depended on in order to be able to do their jobs and to get home in time to take care of their children and fry the bacon and clean up afterwards. So those kinds of protective laws were cherished by a lot of women workers and their allies and their families through the early 1960s. But after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, you'll know that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act forbade employers from discriminating against women as well as against anyone on the basis of race in the workplace. And in 1969, the EEOC determined that Title VII actually disallowed protective labor legislation. And after that, the labor unions pretty much caved and they at least dropped their opposition to the ERA if they didn't outright support it.
I'm glad you mentioned the civil rights movement, because it was the civil rights movement that helped us to gain a lot of the laws that we have today. When we look at women, it didn't just apply to black women. When we look at men, it didn't just apply to black men. Or, we find that the civil rights movement also helped us to move to equal rights for the LGBT community, for the handicapped or the people with disabilities. So the civil rights movement had a lot of impact on what we have today, and it continues to have. And that's why I would like to see white women and white men work more with civil rights groups, because we got the ball rolling, and now we're moving on. We have some other problems with the voter suppression and other things. So we'd like to have more people working with us to sort of pick up that load that we have to work on every day, which is not just women's rights. I'm really proud to be one of the lead organizations and one of the chief spokespersons for the Equal Rights Amendment, but I need some help.
Yes.
Absolutely.
But
Dr.
according
Siani.
to Phyllis, here's our first quote. In 1972, her Phyllis Schlafly report, she wrote, "Of all the classes of people who ever lived, the American woman is the most privileged. We have the most rights and rewards and the fewest duties."
Oh.
I wonder which women she was thinking about.
She still believes that. Yeah, she's still on the radio, Have you heard her lately?
But when we talked earlier today, Dr. Siani, we were talking about the fact that that comes from a distinct place of privilege. So
Right.
it is only because of her privileged place.
Right. So one of the things that we've sort of intimated about up here but haven't been clear about is that the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923 in 1964, in 1972, and when it died in 1982, was primarily a movement of white and middle-class women, both on the pro and on the against sides. So it was a movement that was really generated by women who had resources available to them, and resources of time, resources of money, resources also of being connected to other politicians, whether that be local, state, or federal. So one of the arguments about losing the ERA in the 1970s is that the pro forces stayed centralized in Washington, D.C., with NOW and ERA America were two of the most important pro organizations at the time. But the anti-ERA forces went out into the local and the state levels, and they really gathered forces, their ministers, their pastors, their state legislators, their mayors, most of who were men. And they really made the argument to these individuals that their state and their locale would not benefit from an equal rights amendment. And there have been a lot of scholars, historians, and sociologists and political scientists who have made the argument about that local state level was really critical, as well as, pardon me, as well as most of the states that did not go forward with the amendment were southern states, and they were also democratically connected states. So the state of Illinois was one of the most infamous states. I live there, so I can still testify that we're still infamous. We still don't have a state budget. We're the only state in the union that doesn't have a budget yet. And Daley, Mayor Daley at the time got his Chicago machine going. And he was very angry at women who were involved in NOW, who were kind of playing his politics against him. So he argued that it's guys in the sandbox. He was mad that Adlai Stevenson won the Democratic Convention leadership, and he wanted it. And women in Illinois backed Stevenson. And so he said, well, if you're going to do that, I'm going to do this. So Illinois didn't go forward with it. So it's there's a lot of different angles to, it's not just a class component, it's not just a race component. There's a lot of different elements to it. But I do think that, in what we were talking about earlier, you have to think about it, and I'm a historian, so this is how I think. Historical context, I think it's very, very important. So what was written in the 1920s remained the same in the 1970s, and it didn't work. And some people would argue that that language still doesn't work.
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes so clear that the same words mean something entirely different at different times. That context really does confer meaning. That's the thing that historians believe, is that you can't tell what anything means unless you see the context, because it's context that gives anything its real meaning. And so one way to kind of see that in this case, I think, is that in the 1930s and 40s, and the 20s, before that too, and through the 50s, the ERA was seen as a pro-business measure. And the people who supported it, the first party to support the ERA was the Republican Party in 1940. They saw it as a pro-business measure because it would undermine protective labor legislation, and it would lift any kind of restriction off of employers, allowing them fully to exploit their workers to their heart's content. And so it was seen as an anti-labor, pro-business measure in the 1930s and 1940s and after. And of course, that's going to come to mean something different in the context of the 1960s and 70s. And one of the things that changed, is it okay if I go ahead?
Yeah.
Is that okay? I mean, one of the things that changed so much, part of the context was absolutely the civil rights movement and the passage of the Civil Rights Act, no question about that. Another thing that changed, however, is that women workers had been used to and largely accepted a sex-segregated labor market. And in the industries in which women dominated, so say in the garment industry, right? The labor unions in the garment industry were the last ones to drop their opposition to ERA because protective labor legislation really helped women who were not in competition with men for jobs, right? So if you're in a position in which you're only going to compete with other women, then any kind of protective labor legislation that goes only to women is not going to hurt you at all. It's only going to help you, right? But if you're in a position where you want to compete with a man for a job, then you don't want any restrictions on you, right? Because you want to be able to say to the employer, I can do anything he can do. Right? And in that case, protective legislation is more likely to seem like a harm, to bring harm to you. And so one of the things that's changing then in one of the places that's most obvious in the late 40s is in the auto industry in Michigan, my favorite Michigan again. In Michigan, the auto industry, there weren't too many women in the auto industry, but there was a significant, maybe 10% of the UAW, United Auto Workers, were women. And they were in sex-segregated jobs, and they made less money than men, but they made a decent living compared to other women, thanks to unionization. But they began to think they were never going to get in their female-dominated jobs in the auto industry, they were never going to get wages equal to the guys in the auto industry if they didn't just get out of those female-dominated jobs and compete with the guys for their jobs. And that began to percolate through the UAW in the late 40s and early 50s. And the women in the UAW were among the first in the labor movement to come to support ERA, to decide that protective labor legislation wasn't for them. While women in the garment industry, for instance, held out, the amalgamated clothing workers didn't come to support or didn't drop their opposition to ERA until 1974. So it's really, really late. But the context is what made all the difference. That protective labor legislation was really good for women in female-dominated jobs. And as those diminish, especially in the 1950s, 60s, and then after, the ERA looked better and better.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
I think the average person would say, my, how things have changed,
Yes.
you know, from a time when Republicans were supporting the Equal Rights Amendment and what we have to work with today. But I think one of the advantages we have today is that there's so many enlightened men. I dare say that there is no man in this audience, bar maybe one, who would say, I'm opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment. Just, you know, and you know, I'm not talking about the ones who aren't for the Equal Rights Amendment. So I would just like for each of the men in the audience to turn to somebody and say, she's not talking about me being against the Equal Rights Amendment. So I think it's an advantage now, and particularly with men who are married. It would just seem to me that men who are married would want their wives to work and would want them to have equal pay, because think of how much that increases the family wealth. And the whole burden is not on you to buy that new car for the daughter who's graduating from high school, or they get them at high school now, or you know, the son who is graduating from the military or whatever. I would think that it would be, you know, something really special to have an opportunity to increase the family funds. And that's what the Equal Rights Amendment would do. It would just allow us to get away from that. What is it, 78%? I mean, you know, it's crazy to the dollar that men make, or for black women, it's even less, somewhere in the 60s, and Latino women only in the 50s on a given day. It may also be in the 40s. So I think it's just one way to increasing the wealth that we have in our families, because at one time, you know, I grew up in the South, and to me, all white people were rich. So, you know, that's an idea sometimes I still have today. But I'm finding out that it isn't really true. There are some families who are not black, not Latina, et cetera, who also need that extra help, need to have the women in their families able to make as much as the men make. So men, if you are opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment, raise your hand. You might want to leave at this point. We have one. Well, we wish you well. There's a young woman sitting beside him, and We know what's going to happen tonight.
Well, Dr. Siani, why don't you pick up on that and talk and go ahead and jump right into the opposition and how that was framed at a specific time, and that it really did take hold, and here we are today, all of these years later.
Well, I think that the opposition was very adamant about the positive nature of what they saw as a patriarchal umbrella, and that women and children were protected by this patriarchy, okay? This is coming in a time in the 1960s and the 1970s when we don't have a lot of recognition and acknowledgement about domestic violence. We don't have a lot of acknowledgement and acceptance of criminal behaviors that are happening in the homes. We don't have an understanding of sexual assault. There's a lot of secrets still that are held within family homes. And so the opposition to the ERA is painting the household as a perfect place, as a place that is a positive haven, okay? And the opposition uses the word haven a lot to describe the home. They saw, and then they painted the pro-ERA people as anti-people. So they said that people who were in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment were anti-family, were anti-children, were anti-home, were anti-marriage. So they really used the rhetoric of this negativity that was perceived in the larger general public. And that general rhetoric that was negative was attached to a particular groups of people. The stereotype of the feminist in the 1960s was someone, and I'm smiling because we continue to hear this on the daily news cycle, someone who is shrill, someone who is bold, someone who doesn't take no for an answer, someone who doesn't like men, someone who is this, someone who... So the people like Phyllis Schlafly really pushed that negative message. And if I can go to her words again, I think this is another good quote from her, because she says it like nobody else can, certainly. She says, again, early on in 1972, quote, "It's time to set the record straight. The claim that American women are downtrodden and unfairly treated is the fraud of the century. The truth is that American women never had it so good. Why should we lower ourselves to equal rights when we already have the status of special privilege?" And she argues that based on a Judeo-Christian heritage, based on that heterosexuality that I talked about at the beginning of the hour. And she uses words, she uses Christian tradition a lot, and she, what's her phrase here? Oh, it's just such a good one. Where am I at here? Pardon me. Oh, it's a Christian age of chivalry. So she uses this, she's really masterful at rhetoric. And she argues that, this is a little bit interesting for me to wrap my head around, but she says, quote, "Our Judeo-Christian civilization has developed the law and custom that since women must bear the physical consequences of the sex act, men must be required to bear the other consequences and pay in other ways." So what she's arguing here is that because women are the bearer of children and go through childbirth and the labor of that and the hardship of that, then men owe it to their wives. But again, it's based on a Judeo-Christian understanding of marriage. It's based on a world where birth control is still a very uncomfortable subject for people. She also was very adamant about feminism and the abortion movement, so she used the anti-abortion movement to her advantage and talked about women involved with the ERA as baby killers. So she's very, very, I would call bold and strident in her words, in her use of language, but she does it in a very calm tone, right? It's a very calm tone. And the way she writes is also very calm. So people didn't see her as angry. They saw her as illustrating the perfect wife. And that won her the ERA in 1977.
Yeah. Chris, let me switch to you real quick. So Alice Paul wrote the original amendment, worked on it for her entire life, for the rest of her life at that point, passed away in 1977. Can you give us any thoughts on this, Alice and what she was thinking as far as the opposition to the Equal Rights Movement, to the Equal Rights Amendment by the time the 60s and even the early 70s had rolled around? What were her thoughts at that point?
Sure. I mean, I think we talked just a moment ago about context, and that this amendment that she had helped to write and she authored in the early 20s is very different from what she intends to happen, and very different what indeed happens by the 60s and 70s. So one of the things that's very interesting, I just got done reading a pamphlet produced by the National Women's Party in the 70s, and you can tell Alice Paul is a heavy influence in this, where she talks about, all of these social fears. She says, the opposition will play on these social fears. It's not that she never thought about it, but she said things that would never have come up in the 20s that we're now talking about. So she said, and that's a very powerful way to campaign, to play on social fears. And her opinion in the 20s was that, and I think at the end of her life too, was that if you got the federal amendment for equality, the social things would kind of work themselves out. But by the height of the ERA and the anti-ERA movements, we have all of these social fears become predominant above the ERA. So she's afraid of that. She's also, this is interesting because here she's a pro-ERA, but she's not sure how to deal with what she calls the women's libers, right? So to the public and to the newspaper, she says, yay, you young women are going to take up the mantle, welcome women, right? Behind closed doors, she wants to separate her party from the women's liberation movement because she feels that maybe they're a little bit too radical, or they have so many initiatives that they wanted to pursue, and that would all get tied into the Equal Rights Amendment as well. And the opposition is already doing that, so she kind of wants to separate her amendment. So I think this is a woman who, she's in her 80s and early 90s, and she is, we consider her radical, but maybe she's not so radical in her thought, coming up to a head with these new women who are radical, according to her, and really talking about these social issues, which I think she wanted to disassociate her and her amendment from, in a way. She was happy that Now took up the amendment, but I'm not sure if she knew quite how to feel as all of these issues are coming up. She has arguments for each of the issues, but I don't know what's going on through her head personally at some points.
Yeah. It is fascinating because, Alice Paul formed the National Women's Party with other people, and at that point, they were the young generation. These were the rabble-rousers, the people that were radical themselves. It was the more, the older suffrage parties that were really thinking, now these people are picketing the White House. This is atrocious. They should not be doing this. So it was Alice and her contemporaries that were really the young people that were just radical. And I really like to think about, Alice's time and everything that she had done politically, and that eventually flipped. And then Alice and the rest of the National Women's Party, still in the Sewall-Belmont House, they were now the older generation that was looking at the younger generation saying, wow, those tactics are just a little bit too radical. It's a fascinating look, but I think one that you only get when you have something like the Equal Rights Amendment that has such a long lifespan. We can actually trace this from generation to generation to generation. So,
And I think we face that same thing when we talk about civil rights too, because many of the young people talk about you old people. Of course, they're not talking about me. I'm just, I'm chronologically advanced, but I'm not old. But I hear often young people forget, they'll forget that when Dr. Martin Luther King and when others were working in the civil rights movement, they were young people too. It's just that as you go along, sometimes you change what's most urgently important to you. And in the case of people in my age group, it's a matter of trying to preserve what someone else, struggled to gain. So we're just trying to keep that, while many young people are trying to get new rights that we never thought would be possible.
it is, it's absolutely fascinating. Dr. Siane and Dr. Muncie, you are both history professors. So maybe we could talk a little bit about what do students today think about the Equal Rights Amendment. And I know one of the biggest misconceptions when people walk into the museum is that they're generally shocked that because they think that the Equal Rights Amendment is indeed law and we are all living safely under the Equal Rights Amendment. And that is indeed not the case. And so sometimes it's shocking for them to hear about it from us, but we do always tell them that. And the second thing is they are absolutely shocked by the fact that this was written in the 1920s, not the 1960s or 70s, because the 1960s or 70s to them was ancient time. This is amazing. So Kyle, you were saying earlier about the age of the students that are coming into undergrad classes
They're
today.
born in 1998.
Yeah.
So it's 1998 this year.
I know. There they are.
Yeah.
But I remember the moment I started teaching in the 1980s, and so when I first went into the classroom, students still knew, since the ERA didn't die until 82-ish. Still students I had were coming into college classrooms knew the ERA, so you could talk about the ERA. You could say ERA. It's just so funny. But very shortly after that, by the early 1990s, you'd walk into the classroom and say something about ERA, and they thought you were talking about a laundry detergent.
Yeah.
ERA? They'd look at me like, what are you talking about? And I realized, oh my gosh, it was now not in memory. It was not in memory. So it was something you had to teach as history, not as current events, and not as a part of collective memory. So I think that they don't know much about it now. But I would like to say that in the last few years, students have much more readily, or are coming into my classrooms at least, as feminists. And that had ceased for a long, long time. They are shocked to learn that anybody who called herself a feminist was somebody that they could relate to at all, or think was even a halfway decent human being. But now, young women are coming into the classroom identifying as feminists before they get there. It's a really huge change. So I think there's a lot of energy around feminism and around women's issues, not ERA particularly, but I'm not sure I would say that ERA is the primary issue for women right now. I think there are plenty of other issues that probably are more important to more women immediately than passing the ERA. I think things like raising the minimum wage and paid parental leave and protecting voting rights and the like, I think those are probably more important right this minute to more women than the ERA is. So I would not disagree with their priorities in that way. But it was a remarkable moment, I remember, in the late 80s, early 90s, when suddenly ERA just meant absolutely nothing. It was so in the long ago past that students had not heard of it. Huge change.
Yeah.
I think what happens today is that many of the women's organizations pay more attention to young women, and we do try to teach them about the things that impacted their lives and how they got to be where they are. I know that now, Feminist Majority, my organization, the National Congress of Black Women, all of us have young women who are interns, who work, do real things, not just filing. They do research, they write articles, they read, and so they have a better opportunity to know these issues.
Working.
Yeah, it is.
And being in the National Archives, filing is important, right? We want to keep filing, but very important skill. Yeah, profiling, very, very important. But I would agree with Dr. Muncie in that I think there's a change in terms of and you mentioned young women, and I will add to that young men as well. And so I think just people in college classes now it's expensive to go to college. It's very, it's more expensive now than it was in the 80s. And so if you're going, you're really investing in your education, and you want to be part of the solution, I think, for the most part. And we see that a lot. I'm at Illinois State, and we see that a lot on our college campus. We have a very diverse campus, and we have a lot of students who are very engaged in a wide range of activism. So they tend not to just be in FLAME, which is our feminist organization, but they're also in Pride. They're also in Young Republicans. So that's an interesting combination, people who are in Pride and in Young Republicans. And I think that's really exciting. They're not pigeonholing themselves like we used to do to students. And they're really standing up, and I'm very proud to be doing what I do and working with students. But having said that, they're incredibly naive to how the world works. And you should be, I suppose, at that age, right? You should be. But one of the things that makes me very uncomfortable about that statement is I don't think it's their fault. I think we're not teaching them at the middle school and high school level history the way that we used to. And I can also say that with some sort of authority because we have a history education program. We're the best in the nation. So we train the most, we train the most teachers in the country. And it's very difficult for us to repair some of the damage of the ignorance that they're bringing to us. And so they get to, we've been talking about historical context, and I'll always ask my students, how far did you get in your US history class? How far did you get? Maybe they know about the World War II. And you know what they know about World War II? Well, they kind of know what the Holocaust is. They've never heard of Japanese internment. Yeah. And they know who Rosie the Riveter is, a cartoon character, right? So so what we're teaching in our high school and our middle schools is not appropriate. It's just not training them to really deal with the world. And they can vote, right? So for me, it's really critical. I want them to understand how to vote, how to make those decisions.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned high school and young men because young men play an important part in how women are treated in this country too and around the world. So we welcome the help of young men, and I'm really pleased as we go about campuses and in high schools and colleges. We see that some young men are taking the lead in being supporters of the Equal Rights Amendment. So I'm very proud of them, and I think we need to encourage the young men too, because after all, many of them have sisters, they have a mother, of course, and someday they are going to have daughters, and certainly I would like to hope that they'd want equality of opportunity for their daughters and their sisters and their mothers.
Exactly.
I teach a gender studies course at my local college, and I started in 2009, and every year I've had more and more young men join the course and enjoy the course. So I think that's great. I just wanted to point out really quickly, though, social media, I think, is what you may love it or hate it, but I think for our students, it's one of the things that really connects them and makes them feel like part of a community. And I think that it's what helps them to learn about the issues. They may not be studying the issues, but they are connected to them. And I think that kind of helps in a way. It can hinder, but like my students say, I know about this issue from they don't use Facebook, but some kind of social media. And I'm like, well, I'm impressed by that because they didn't learn it in school and they don't watch the news, but they can pick up information pretty quickly through social media. So we're trying to explore ways that we can use that to spread the message of Equal Rights Amendment and other legislation that would affect specifically women.
Exactly. Well, we just have a couple of minutes left before we will turn it over to audience questions. So let me ask one closing question of the panelists. Why do you think that some or even many of the feminist activists today might not make the ERA their top priority? We talked around about that a little bit, but maybe just give 2 or 3 sentences about why you think they really don't.
Well, I'll start. Did you name someone to start it? Or?
No.
Oh, okay. I think one of the reasons is that there are so many issues out there that they have to be concerned about. I know in our community, for example, we've faced a lot of challenging situations just over this past year when we've seen a young black woman being stopped for a routine traffic stop and wind up dead when she's in custody. And she's not the only one. We've had several others that we've had to think about. And we haven't always heard the outcry from the larger community about that issue. We looked at a young girl whose friend was being slammed across the room. And, she was criminally charged just for speaking up for her friend. Then we looked down in Texas last summer when the police officer took the young woman in the bathing suit and did a body slam with her. So those are all things that in our community, when I say our community, I mean the black community, that we have to think about, and we don't always hear the outcry from the larger community. So we have to think about that, plus, the wages, fair wages, what have you. You'll see us on picket lines all over the place. As a matter of fact, my friends laugh at me because I usually keep picket signs in the back of my car, and if I see a cause, that I believe in, I'll walk up sometimes and say, "What are you picketing for?" "Oh, let me go to the car and get the right sign to go out here." We've just all got to be activists on each other's behalf, and we've got to see other people's issues as the same kind of issues we have. Maybe not the same subject, but the point is we can get more people to support our issues when we're supporting their issues, because in the final analysis, they're all human issues, and if we want to be for human rights, then we've got to speak up for everybody's cause. All human beings must be treated and thought of as human beings, so that's why I never hesitate. I've slept out in the park in the snow with the Latinos, with the Native Americans. I've gone all over to London and every place with people who had a problem with British Petroleum not paying the poor people. I mean, I see every one of those issues as somehow connected to me, and I want to be there to help to make the difference that I can make. Don't always have the money to give money for causes, but where I can, I do. And I would just like to encourage people to know that there's always something that you can do to make a difference in the life of somebody else. It may be small, but it makes a difference.
Absolutely. I want to hear from the rest of the panelists, but I want to let everybody know that there are microphones on either side, so you can start lining up if you have questions for the panelists. And why don't we go ahead down the road to, right down the line to Dr. Muncy.
Right, I mean, I think that there are a lot of issues that, as I said this earlier, I was going to repeat myself, I guess, but I think there are a lot of issues that are more important to more women immediately than the Equal Rights Amendment would be. So I think raising the minimum wage is really crucial to wage earning women. I think that paid parental leave is crucial. I think restoring voting rights is absolutely crucial. It's crucial to women, it's crucial to families, it's crucial to all of us. And the immediate payoff of those is more obvious, I think, than the Equal Rights Amendment, which doesn't seem in any immediate sense to be urgent.
Yeah, definitely. Dr. Siani.
Yeah, I would agree with both my colleagues here, and I also would say, just add to that, the military-industrial complex in which we live and the immigration issues that we are either dealing with or ignoring, I think are issues that touch us on a global basis. It's something that in the 1970s was sort of ignored. So one of the things that the anti-ERA people really emphasized was that if we had an ERA, women would have to go into the military. And so we've since passed that, right? Women do participate in armed conflict and in an almost not exactly equal way, but somewhat of an equal manner. But I think we're dealing with things like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, in ways we have to deal with those issues in ways that people, again, ignored them earlier. We have to deal with health care. We have to deal with medical attention. And our infrastructure is failing. God, I sound so negative. But there's so much going on. We have so many needs right now. So I'm not sure that the Equal Rights Amendment is forefront in people's minds.
I work with 48 teenage girls through the Alice Paul Institute's Girls Advisory Council, and I can tell you that every one of those girls has no idea of what the ERA is and that it never passed. So for them, it is a brand new concept, but as soon as they learn it, they are excited and charged. So if you want some new activists for the ERA, you got to tell them about it because they don't know. It's ignorance, but it's not chosen ignorance. It's certainly not something that they're being taught in school. They get very little international relations as well. But when they learn about it, they are charged, they are passionate, and I think that is perhaps the next message. They haven't experienced a lot of discrimination yet, and that's the other half of the coin right there. But I don't want them to. I want them to not have to experience it. But for them, it's just a matter of an educational experience.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much. We have people that are already queued up for questions. So why don't we just make it easy and we'll start here and then we'll go back and forth. So.
When we discuss women's suffrage, we usually discuss the U.S. vis-a-vis other countries, and we were part of a wave at that time. We haven't discussed how other countries deal with the ERA, and I'm not sure if that's part of your purview, but could it be discussed how does the rest of the world think of equal rights?
That's a great question. Is there anyone that wants to start with that?
Go ahead.
One of the things I think you can do is begin by looking at Where Do We Invade Next, Michael Moore's movie, and you can see that in fact there are some countries that are ahead of us on women's rights. And then of course on the other side where they're not, some of us have helped legally to write laws for other nations. We work with women in many ways, but we don't always assume that we're ahead of everybody else in the world.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, we are, there's a lot of countries that are ahead of us. My students always say every year, oh, I'm going to move to Sweden, right? Because, they pass legislation that half of their half of their government has to be women. And they did that, I believe in the 70s. Yeah. And now they're seeing the effects of that and the fruits of that labor. So, and they have childcare and health care and all of these great things that I think people like Alice Paul were originally fighting for. And we're also one of, 6 nations that has not passed CEDAW. Yeah. The United States, we stand out in a very strange way because we haven't passed the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which 126 other nations have, and we are one of 6. Right?
Yeah.
So.
And several other nations have already had women presidents, and we've not.
Exactly.
Not yet.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things at the museum is we work very closely with the State Department and other organizations that bring international groups through the museum. And what we do is we bring them through, we tell them the story, we give them a tour, and then we often sit after for a few minutes and let them ask, you've got American women sitting here, ask us questions, ask us whatever you would like to be. We might not be the experts in that, but we can certainly tell you from a personal level what we think. And some of the questions that we get from them are absolutely astounding. We've had women from 17 or 18 different countries come through in the last 18 months. And the women who come from Muslim countries are often the most unyielding for us. They'll say, you don't have an equal rights amendment. Why are you running a museum? You should be picketing. What are you doing? And we'll say, well, Thank you. We're lucky in America that we have the opportunity to preserve this story, to make sure that, our students, our children and our students as they're coming through, get the background information and understand this. And we're also lucky to have lots of other women who are activists and are still very actively working on that. So it's not necessarily the answer that they wanted to hear, but it is the answer of what we do and how we try to make that balance here. Let's go right over here.
You can see by my cane I'm a little older than some of the folks here. I'm really glad to see young faces in the audience. When I first became the now president in Northern Virginia, my phone number, my home phone number, was put into the phone directory, talk about an ancient idea, as Northern Virginia Now. And in that first year, I ended up with over 500 calls to my number by battered women and raped women. I had guys with shotguns on my front porch, quite willing to shoot me so they could perpetrate further violence on their women. And while Phyllis Schlafly was portraying the home as a haven, I was dealing with the bleeding bodies and the other women, because we set up, when this happened, the only place that would shelter a woman was Christ House in Alexandria, and they would not take her children in. Now, what really violated woman would leave her children behind? And we also started court watching, because we found that the judges in a southern state, I can remember one woman coming in who was deaf as a result of the violence and being beaten around the head. And the judge, the sitting judge, said to her, "Well, honey, did you deserve it?"
Oh, goodness.
And the violence continues. The home still is not a haven. And I think that we have to think about the core rights of survival. Do women have the right to thrive? How do we come to a place where we face no violence and no discrimination? Right. And I, as a Quaker, tend to believe that Alice Paul was not off in terms of her ultimate goal. I think from generation to generation, we have different tactics and perhaps different motivations. But I think that desire to be equal, to have the glass ceiling vanish, I think women all along the way have seen that as something they wanted, at least as I read my Quaker sources. I think that was true. And of course, Alice Paul grew up among friends.
Of course.
So I think that also makes a difference.
It is. And I think that goes to what Dr. Williams was just saying about the fact that we all must be diligent. We must be diligent with our family and our friends, and we must find ways to make our communities better. Yeah.
I think we also have Vice President Joe Biden to thank for the Violence Against Women Act. That is a good start, but all of us need to be more vigilant, because if you look at 5 women, 5 on the stage, at least somebody in this group has been has had domestic violence, whether it's a son or daughter or spouse or what have you. We need to pay more attention to this issue. I meet women all the time that you would never think, just from looking at them, that they were abused women.
Yeah,
I think one of the great paradoxes of the Equal Rights Amendment movement is that at a time when the ERA was being rescinded and failing was a time when women's activists like yourself were recognizing the personal is political, and were really starting to take on the issues in your own homes. And you weren't waiting for governmental intervention, but you were doing it yourself. And I think history has shown us that across the states, domestic violence shelters were being established in many different ways. in the 1970s and in the 1980s. Now, they didn't start at that time, but they really expanded during that time. You know, the sources will show us that back in the, you know, the colonial era, there were women who were taking in other women. But I think the feminist movement of the 1960s and the 1970s really did a service to women who were not being heard in a public setting. And I think that's important. Thank you for raising that. I think it's a really important issue.
It absolutely is. Let's go right over here.
Well, the Equal Rights Amendment itself, I came in a couple minutes late, so I don't know if anybody actually said it out loud. But it's vague. You know, it's just a couple sentences, there shall be equal rights. And I would say that there are not all the issues that you raise as prominent and important issues to deal with now could be dealt with under the Equal Rights Amendment. But as a lawyer, I would say if we had an Equal Rights Amendment, it would be a powerful legal tool to deal with at least some of the issues raised. For example, fair pay. Why do we push minimum wage? Well, we push it for men and women, but in fact, many more women than men are at that level. Many issues in the workplace, talking about protective legislation, said we could have bathroom breaks. Well, that's still an issue today. Pregnant women do not get bathroom breaks in many jobs, and crazy hours and so forth. If there were an Equal Rights Amendment, I think it would be a powerful tool for many of the issues that we deal with. And actually, you mentioned the military, and at least my recollection from the late 70s and 80s is, in addition to the home as a haven and that major theme of Phyllis Schlafly's, two of the issues I recall that were mentioned again and again were women would have to be drafted and women would have to be in combat.
And the potties.
And exactly, that was what I was going to say. And the third thing was we'd all have to use the same bathrooms.
Yeah, right.
Which, of course, in my house, that is true. We do all use the same bathroom. But at any rate, these issues don't go away. And I think, in fact, love more comments on that. But it does seem to me, if there really were a push for the ERA and it was actually clear what it might be used to correct, it really could be seen as an important tool for women and for men, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. I think Alice Paul, she wrote so many drafts of the ERA. The final one that she actually changes in 1943 is the one that we know today, and she intentionally kept it vague. And I think with that idea that it could be used from a lot of different angles in court, and she wanted, is the correct term, strict scrutiny in the court system. So that was her goal, and keeping it vague intentionally was her goal as well. That was intended, definitely.
Definitely. Right over here.
First of all, I have to tell you a story that Alice Paul and Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly, I don't know if you know, made a speech about 4 years ago in Berkeley. She was invited to talk about feminism versus conservatism. She finished her speech, walked around the podium, and fell off the stage and broke her hip. Okay,
no.
I always say that Alice Paul was there, and she pushed her because she was tired of it. And the second thing is that we are working on the ERA, if you don't know it, in Virginia. We've passed it 5 times in the Senate from Virginia. We can't get it through the House. It's being worked on in Illinois, Nevada, Florida, North Carolina, and we're pushing very hard. But we need, and 5 states said they rescinded, but the Supreme Court said that it's not possible. There's no apparatus in the Constitution to let you do that. You'd have to start all over again to rescind it. So my question is, I'm noticing your pictures, you had a lot of people in there, in the pictures like Ellie Smeal and Alice Cohan, who worked on this, and you've got the lady that just spoke, was one of the original marchers in Virginia from Richmond to well, no, DC to Richmond, and she was one of your Illinois fasters. So why aren't we having a program with people telling the stories about the past, all these people? Because 2 years ago, or 2 or 3 years ago, you had people talking about the ERA, and one professor said, it's actually dead. So it was amazing to me. So we need to have a program to tell the stories in order to get these people to write their books and talk about them.
You're right.
Absolutely.
Just recently, Jessica Newworth wrote a book called Equal Means Equal. Kamala Lopez from California has a movie by the same name, a documentary. In fact, they will be in town on next Thursday night, I believe, at the U.S. Capitol. You can go online to the ERA Coalition and find out more details about it. Some of us go around the country. I know that I've been to Wake Forest University and others, and we do tell the stories, as you're saying. Not enough yet, but we're working on it, and we certainly will be having a meeting on Tuesday with the coalition, and I'll bring that up, because stories are very powerful when you can hear from someone who's actually...
And you all are at universities. We need, in Virginia now has a history project. We've been going and making a long list of women who worked on the ERA, who are important to the ERA, or through women's thing, and we've been interviewing them, and we give our tapes to the Smithsonian. You need to be doing that too with your graduate students and all, getting them out there to interview. These women are dying before we can even get to them.
Just to let you know, we are doing that at Illinois State. Nothing is happening in state legislation in Illinois. So it's at a standstill, right? So if you're hoping for the ERA to go forward, I don't know, Alice works the magic, because nothing is happening in the state of Illinois.
We need more
right
women
now.
in the legislature.
We are, I think that a lot of universities have very excellent oral history programs. And those of us who do work with graduate students and do have master's programs, we really push oral history. And we push particularly at, I'll just talk about my institution, but we do a lot with local history. And there are, our former director of Women and Gender Studies was very active in the ERA and went toe-to-toe, head-to-head with Phyllis in Springfield. So we have her stories, we have her collection. I think one of the things that is really important about public history and oral history especially is that you get these smaller stories and you weave the smaller stories together and you get that national picture, right? So yeah, I absolutely agree with you that we need the stories, and I think they're happening. They really are.
I think so. Go right over here.
Hello. This has been mentioned briefly before, just recently, about the draft. And that's something I've become very interested in, especially I think it's pretty relevant right now. That was just on discussion on the Hill. So maybe if you could talk more about that and where that fits in, especially today, because it's something I haven't really encountered in, my research on feminist movements today as well. So.
Okay, all right.
I know Alice Paul and the National Women's Party stance on the draft in the 70s. Women's organizations had gotten together to talk about it, and I think the consensus at that point was that women should be eligible for the draft, and that legally both men and women could be called for a draft at any point. Alice Paul personally felt that with a volunteer army, which would start in the 70s, that there wouldn't be a need for the draft anymore. She's kind of right now, so knock on wood, right? Wood. I'm not sure. And she said, by the way, women have always been in the Army. They've always been there, but not necessarily recognized for it. So I'm not sure how she would feel about what was going on today, but I think at the core of it, she would say, women should be drafted. Not that she would want them to be drafted, but that legally she would see that if you want true equality, then this is one of the products of equality as well.
Right.
Do you guys want to add to that?
Yeah.
maybe somebody here actually knows what's going on with this. I mean, I saw some little blurb that suggested that that some authorization bill that was coming through, help us out here then, is going to require that 18-year-old women register so that they're registered. Help us.
Yeah.
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 I see, yes.
definitely.
So to prevent it. I
Right.
see.
Dr. Williams, do you encounter this when you're out speaking and when your organization is out speaking?
I think maybe the audiences to which I speak are often already ready for the Equal Rights Amendment. I don't find any opposition at all. They're just hungry for more information so that they know how to explain the Equal Rights Amendment to their friends and to their families. I had one woman in North Carolina recently who raised the question about her husband objecting to her coming out to the meeting that we were having, and she wanted to know what was the solution to that. He was obviously an older man, well, a chronologically advanced man. He was in his 80s, I believe, and he strongly objected, and she asked us what did we think she could do, and I suggested she could just get a divorce, you know, and marry someone. But, you know, she came up to me afterwards, and she was serious. She said, you know, I'm thinking of doing just that.
Oh, my heavens. I guess there's always.
Just to talk about the draft a little bit, I think one of the things that is, again, a common thread that weaves through from the 1920s up to the present, really, is that there are a lot of men and women, but women especially, who are involved in peace activism. So the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, right, began with World War I. Women's Strike for Peace. There are so many different organizations that are engaged in the activism of peace, global peace, local peace, right? So I think that the draft is something that would be very contentious of both men and women and transgender people. I mean, I think all people who, I don't know that we would be able to get a draft through in this climate, but I don't know that they thought that they would get a draft through before either. Right. So, but I think that it is, you mentioned social media. I think there are so many different immediate ways to find out about activism that I don't know that a draft would fly. I really don't.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm an optimist. I'm a peace activist, so that's my bias. I don't believe in a draft, but I'm a peace activist.
And can I just add to Alice Paul believed that if more women were involved in government, that they could help the peace movement.
Right.
Which I think is an interesting point.
Yeah, it is. It is. If you don't mind staying around for a little bit, I'd love to get your contact information because there are organizations that I can put you in touch with that might be able to get you some information. Definitely. Right over here.
Hi, I am the newly indoctrinated Virginia Now Vice President. I'm just a shameless plug. But I'd like to also share, when I saw the ERA bracelet, I'm wearing one now by a group, by an organization called leftwingbling.com. Again, another shameless plug, but I love the ERA so much. I was brought under the wings of the current Virginia Now president to talk about the ERA because I thought it was laundry detergent. I had no idea what it was. And at 40-some years old, I'm thinking, I'm smart, I've went to college, I've heard about this, but what's the direct impact for me as a woman, as a single mom, you know, raising kids, as a woman of color, having children of color, all of these things, all these sectional pieces. So as we approach, I'm going to jump to the presidential campaign, you know, that I'm seeing now. And as I was learning about the ERA, as I'm educating myself about this topic, because yes, to the lawyer that said it is a broad statement in that, you know, passing it can help, but it has so much deeper meaning than those few sentences that we have. I'm watching the presidential election and I'm seeing some of the challenge I had without screaming through my TV is seeing some of the young women talk about the candidate that they were supporting and that would not vote for a woman because she's a woman. Now, in one ideal. I get it. I understand what they're trying to say, that gender shouldn't be an issue. But in the same ideal, I think they're cutting off the issue of what the ERA was speaking to, the discrimination, because we are women, that we may not be capable of serving or breaking the glass ceiling or being represented in our community or seen as leaders. And so that's my challenge. What would you say to young women that make that statement that I'm not voting for a woman, or I'm not standing with women, or supporting women just because of their gender? I know that it's not intended for a discrimination piece or topic. It's tend to lean towards not discriminating, and that's kind of where the blurry lines in the conversation get mixed up.
Yeah, that's a good question.
There are two sides to the coin, because Alice Paul would say, I give you Alice Paul's opinion, you know, you shouldn't vote for the candidate because they're a woman, you should vote because of their qualifications. However, you have to go to the Judy Chicago, right? You need more women at the table in order to address issues that do affect women specifically. So I think it's a double-sided coin.
It is.
And I think that it will be great when we get to a point where we are choosing our candidates for their qualities and not their gender. But I do hope that we can elect more women into legislative positions for the sake of helping women, but also just addressing issues that are going to affect women and that are going to affect men as well. So
Maybe the conversation could start younger, putting gender studies in high school.
definitely, I
I
agree.
I think that women, I think we need to vote for people whose policies we support,
Right.
whether they are men or women.
Exactly.
If Phyllis Schlafly were running for president, we would not say we should all vote for Phyllis Schlafly because she's a woman, because she doesn't support policies that we think would be best for women, for most women. So I think I'm all with those young women who say, I'm not going to vote for somebody just because she's a woman. If the policy positions were the same and you had a choice between a man and a woman, I'd say affirmative action kicks in and you go for the woman, absolutely, because we do need more progressive feminist women in positions of power. But I agree that policy comes first, and that if you think that the policies are going to help more women, you vote for that candidate, not for a woman.
I would also say that 44 times we've selected a man for our president. Isn't it time that we show our daughters that they're smart, they're wonderful, they can do things, and just this one time we could have a woman? You know, I don't see that always the argument is that the woman is not as smart. As a matter of fact, right now I see a very smart woman who's running for president. I would have no problem this time saying, well, I'm voting for her because she's a woman and she's wonderful and she's smart and she's going to do a great job, and I know that she supports the policies I support. I would be very emphatic with our daughters about that, and our sons about that, because they need to know that that young women can be just as smart and wonderful. And we've had women around the world already who've shown how smart they were and how good they were for their countries. It's time for us to do that, even, you know, if you previously didn't believe that women could do anything. But if you continue for number 45 and 46 and 47 and so on to say no woman is smart enough, I think something's wrong with that picture.
Absolutely. Well, we have 2 minutes left.
I was
Is
just
there
going to
quick
give a
question
quick
here?
clarification because we started talking about the draft. So what happened in the Senate today was that right now we don't have a draft, but still young men have to sign up when they're 18. So what passed in the Senate today was that young women, when they turn 18, would also have to sign up. I mean, an alternative would be to not have anybody sign up. And it sounds like some people might prefer that. But at any rate, I don't know what's going to happen in the House, but the idea was that if young men sign up, so young women should sign up too. And that we'll see where that goes. But I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have just enough time for any very last-minute comments that you would like to make. Is there anything that you wanted to say but didn't get to say, or that we skipped over too quickly and we didn't get back to you?
I'd just like to say I'm delighted to see so many people here.
Yeah.
I wondered if anybody would come out to talk about the laundry detergent yesterday and today. So anyway, I think it's just great. Thank you so much for coming.
It is. It's wonderful. It is.
I would also say, particularly to minority women, or that we need to support the Equal Rights Amendment, just as the Civil Rights Movement helped women of all races, all colors, all creeds, etc. So can the Equal Rights Amendment help not only women but men too.
Yes. Yes, it can.
In terms of education, I would just ask all of us to encourage your school systems to expand the educational offerings at the middle school and the high school level. You suggested high school. I think we need to go younger than that. I really think we need to go into the middle schools. I tried to do that at the lab school, and they said, well, you know, we don't have time. We have to do science and math, right? So we've been focusing on STEM for so long. That's wonderful, but we need to refocus on humanities, and that's my pitch.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, thank
what
you.
you mentioned
Oh,
before too, which is just we need to be having these conversations. It's been such a taboo subject that we don't even talk about anything related to women's rights, and we're not talking about one half of the entire country because we're so afraid that somebody will bring up the issue of abortion, right? It's so controversial, but we need to have these discussions because we need to know, you know, why do we support an Equal Rights Amendment, or why are we against an Equal Rights Amendment? What are the issues? So I think have conversations with your friends, have conversations with your students and your children and your parents, and let's not shy away from this topic. It's a good one.
Exactly. It is a good one. And we obviously need to have more conversations. So hopefully this is the beginning of a series of conversations, and maybe we will be invited back and we'll keep talking another day.
That's great.